A twist you won't forget. The biting winter wind whipped through the empty streets of downtown as Sarah huddled beneath a warm blanket in the doorway of an abandoned shop. At just 19, she had already learned more about survival than most people do in a lifetime. Through the frosted glass, she watched the usual parade of suited executives rushing past, clutching their designer briefcases and steaming coffee cups, never sparing her a glance. But this evening was different. As the street lamps flickered to life, she noticed an elderly gentleman in an impeccably tailored suit walking arm in arm with a much younger woman. Something about the scene made Sarah's stomach twist. Maybe it was the way the woman's smile never quite reached her eyes, or how her manicured hand kept fidgeting with her purse. The couple stopped at the high-end CAF across the street, the same one that had thrown Sarah out last week when she tried to warm up inside. Through the large windows, she could see them settling into a cozy corner booth. The woman excused herself, leaving her designer handbag behind. As she walked to the restroom, Sarah noticed her removing something from her clutch, a small vial that glinted under the CAF lights. Sarah's heart began to race. 6 months on the streets had taught her to read people, to spot danger before it struck. And right now, every instinct was screaming that something was terribly wrong. She watched in horror as the woman carefully tipped the contents of the vial into her husband's coffee cup while he was distracted by his phone. Without thinking, Sarah pushed herself up from her doorway sanctuary. Her legs were stiff from sitting in the cold, but adrenaline propelled her forward. She burst through the CAF door, ignoring the startled looks from other patrons and the approaching security guard. "Sir, please don't drink that," she called out, her voice hoarse from lack of use. The businessman looked up, confusion crossing his weathered features. "Your wife. I saw her put something in your coffee while you weren't looking." The CAF fell silent. The security guard froze mid-step. And then, something unexpected happened. The elderly man started to laugh. Not a nervous chuckle, but a deep, genuine laugh that seemed to warm the entire room. The other patrons stared as he stood up and walked over to Sarah, who was now trembling from both cold and fear. "My dear," he said softly, reaching into his pocket, "you've just answered a question I've been asking myself for months." He pulled out a business card and pressed it into her shaking hands. "And I believe you've also solved another problem I've been grappling with." As his wife returned from the restroom, her confident stride faltered at the sight before her. The color drained from her face as she saw Sarah standing there, still clutching the businessman's card. But before anyone could say another word, 2 plainclothes detectives stepped forward from their tables, badges already in hand. What happened next would change Sarah's life forever, though not in the way anyone might expect. Because sometimes, the smallest act of courage can unlock doors we never knew existed. And on that cold winter evening, in a high-end CAF where she wasn't supposed to belong, Sarah was about to discover that fate had much bigger plans for her than surviving another night on the streets. But first, she had to understand why this wealthy businessman had been expecting something like this to happen, and why he seemed more intrigued than shocked by her warning. As the detectives led the stunned wife away in handcuffs, the elderly businessman, who introduced himself as Richard Bennett, insisted that Sarah join him for dinner at a nearby restaurant. Wrapped in his expensive wool coat that he draped around her shoulders, Sarah found herself seated in a warm booth, trying to process everything that had just happened. "I've been watching people walk past me for months," Sarah said quietly, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate. "Most of them pretend I don't exist. But your wife, she never even noticed me. That kind of invisibility. Sometimes it lets you see things others miss." Richard nodded thoughtfully, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. 6 months ago, I was diagnosed with a rare heart condition," he revealed. "Shortly after, my wife began showing an unusual interest in my medication schedule, my will, my business affairs. Things she'd never cared about during our 3 years of marriage." Sarah listened intently as he continued, "I hired private investigators, installed security cameras in our home, even had my food tested, but she was too careful. too patient. I knew she was planning something, but I couldn't prove it. So I decided to give her an opportunity she couldn't resist. The CAF. Sarah whispered, realization dawning. You chose it because of the big windows. You wanted someone to see. I chose it because you were there, Richard corrected her. I've watched you too, you know. Every morning for the past 2 weeks, I've seen you help that old newspaper vendor set up his stand. Yesterday, you shared your blanket with a stray dog. The day before, you gave your last sandwich to a lost child. You see, I needed someone who hadn't lost their humanity despite losing everything else. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she stared down at her untouched slice of apple pie. She thought about all the times she'd wished someone would really see her as more than just another homeless teenager. And now, when she'd finally been seen, it had led to this surreal moment. But why risk your life? She asked. What if I hadn't said anything? Richard's expression grew serious. Because sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most important changes. Those detectives weren't just there by chance. They've been building a case against my wife and her accomplices for months. She's part of a larger scheme targeting wealthy older men. Your warning today wasn't just about saving my life, it helped us catch an entire criminal organization. As Sarah absorbed this information, a well-dressed woman approached their table, her badge identifying her as Detective Claire Sullivan. We found the vial, she announced. Lab results confirm it contained a lethal combination of untraceable compounds. Mr. Bennett, we'll need you to come down to the station to make a formal statement. But Richard wasn't looking at the detective. Instead, his eyes were fixed on Sarah. Before we go anywhere, he said, I have a proposition for you. You see, I'm not just a businessman, I run one of the largest charitable foundations in the city. And we've been looking for someone with first-hand experience to help reform our homeless youth program. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she realized what he was suggesting. But before she could respond, Detective Sullivan interjected with news that would make this evening even more extraordinary. Because sometimes, the universe has a way of connecting dots we never knew existed, and Sarah's past was about to collide with her future in ways nobody could have predicted. Detective Sullivan pulled out a worn photograph from her case file, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it on the table. Sarah Thompson, she said softly, we've been looking for you for 3 years. The image showed a younger Sarah, standing beside a woman who shared her honeyed blonde hair and gentle eyes, her mother. The warmth of the restaurant suddenly felt stifling as Sarah's past came rushing back. She'd run away at 16, not because of abuse or neglect, but because she thought she was protecting her family. How did you? She whispered, unable to finish the sentence. Your mother never stopped searching, Detective Sullivan explained. She's been working with us, helping other runaway teens while trying to find you. And now, it turns out you're our star witness in one of the biggest cases we've handled this year. Richard reached across the table, his weathered hand resting supportively on Sarah's shoulder. My foundation works closely with the Missing Persons Division, he revealed. Claire here has been updating me about various cases, including yours. When I first noticed you outside the CAF, something about your story felt familiar. Sarah's mind raced back to that terrible night 3 years ago. She'd overheard conversations she wasn't supposed to hear, seen documents that weren't meant for her eyes. Her mother had been an accountant for a prestigious firm, and Sarah had accidentally discovered evidence of a massive fraud scheme. But instead of going to the police, her teenage mind had convinced her that running away would keep her family safe from the people involved. The organization we've been investigating, Detective Sullivan continued, the one that Richard's wife is connected to, they're the same people you discovered 3 years ago. Your mother's evidence helped us start this investigation, but we could never prove the connection to the murder attempts on wealthy men until now. Richard's expression shifted from compassionate to stunned. Your mother is Catherine Thompson? He asked. She's been my foundation's chief financial advisor for the past year. She took the position specifically to help track these criminals, knowing they targeted charitable organizations to find wealthy victims. Sarah felt the room spinning as all the pieces started falling into place. Her mother hadn't just been looking for her, she'd been working to bring down the entire criminal enterprise that had separated them. And now, without even knowing it, Sarah had helped complete the investigation. But before they could continue, Detective Sullivan's phone buzzed urgently. Her face paled as she read the message. "Richard's wife isn't talking," she said grimly, "but her phone records show she made a call right before we arrested her. There's chatter on our surveillance channels. They know we're here." The restaurant's large windows suddenly felt like spotlights exposing them to unseen eyes. A black SUV crawled past outside, its tinted windows reflecting the golden glow of street lamps. Richard's security team, stationed discreetly around the restaurant, shifted nervously. "We need to move," Detective Sullivan announced, already rising from her seat. "Sarah, your mother is waiting at a safe house across town. But we have to assume they'll be watching every route there." Sarah looked between Richard and the detective, her heart pounding. After 3 years of hiding in plain sight, of surviving on streets that had taught her every trick of staying invisible, she now needed those skills more than ever. Because somewhere in this city, her mother was waiting, and between them stood an organization that would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. As they moved toward the restaurant's back exit, Sarah caught a glimpse of movement in the alley beyond. And in that moment, she realized that the next few hours would determine not just her future, but the safety of everyone she'd come to care about. Through the restaurant's back door, they emerged into the dimly lit alley, where Detective Sullivan's unmarked car waited. But before they could reach it, Sarah grabbed Richard's arm, pulling him to a stop. 3 years on the streets had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, everything felt wrong. "The bodyguards," she whispered urgently. "Where did they go?" The men who had been watching the restaurant had vanished, leaving the alley eerily empty. Detective Sullivan reached for her weapon, but Sarah's next words made her freeze. "And why hasn't that cat moved?" In the shadows near the dumpster, a tabby cat sat unnaturally still, its form barely visible in the darkness. Richard squinted, then his eyes widened in recognition. "That's not a real cat," he breathed. "It's a surveillance camera. One of my company's prototypes, but I never approved its deployment." Detective Sullivan's phone suddenly crackled to life with static, then a familiar voice filled the alley. "I always told you your soft heart would be your downfall, Richard." It was his wife, speaking from the police station where she was supposedly in custody. "Did you really think I married you just for your money?" The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Sarah watched as Richard's face transformed with understanding. "The Foundation," he said quietly. "You wanted access to my Foundation's technology division. The murders were just a cover for something bigger. 3 years of playing the perfect wife," the voice continued, "just to access your research on autonomous surveillance systems. The other wealthy men? Convenient distractions. But thanks to your little homeless hero here, we had to accelerate our timeline." Sarah's mind raced back to all the conversations she'd overheard on the streets, snippets about missing tech prototypes and mysterious data breaches. The pieces were falling into place: her mother's accounting firm, Richard's foundation, the seemingly random targeting of wealthy men. It was all connected to something much darker. Suddenly, lights flooded the alley from both ends. Black SUVs blocked their escape routes as figures emerged from the shadows. But among them was a face that made Sarah's blood run cold: her mother's former boss, the man she'd seen in those incriminating documents 3 years ago. "Hello, Sarah," he said smoothly, adjusting his expensive cufflinks. "You've grown since you ran away with that flash drive. The one you thought you'd destroyed? We've been watching you ever since, waiting for you to lead us to your mother. And now, thanks to this little drama with Richard's wife, we finally have everyone we need in one place." Detective Sullivan moved to shield Sarah, but Richard stepped forward instead, his voice steady despite the danger. "You're right about one thing," he said. My soft heart has always been my weakness. That's why I made sure to have a backup plan. He reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, but for his phone. With trembling fingers, he pressed a single button. Instantly, the mechanical cat's eyes glowed blue, and every screen in the alley, phones, tablets, even the SUV's navigation systems lit up with the same pulsing light. What have you done? Richard's wife's voice crackled through the static, panic evident in her tone. But before anyone could respond, sirens began wailing in the distance, growing closer by the second. And high above the alley, a news helicopter's searchlight cut through the darkness, its camera already broadcasting everything live across every major network in the city. But as their captors scrambled in confusion, Sarah noticed something else, a small red dot blinking on Richard's chest. Someone in the shadows had made a different plan, and the next few seconds would determine who would survive to tell this story. The red dot trembled on Richard's chest as time seemed to freeze in the alley. But just as the hidden shooter's finger tightened on the trigger, a familiar voice rang out. Now! It was Catherine Thompson, Sarah's mother, emerging from behind the mechanical cat, holding what looked like a small remote control. In that instant, all the pieces fell perfectly into place. The mechanical cat wasn't just a surveillance device, it was a signal jammer, now activated by Catherine's remote. Every weapon's electronic safety mechanism in the alley suddenly engaged, rendering them useless. It was the prototype Richard's wife had been truly after, but not for the reasons they thought. 3 years, Catherine announced, her voice steady as she stepped into the light. 3 years of working undercover, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment. Sarah didn't run away to protect me, I sent her away, with a flash drive containing a program that would take 3 years to decrypt and activate. A program that would give us control of every piece of technology this organization had stolen. The crime boss lunged forward, but Sarah was faster. Years of street survival had honed her reflexes, and she knocked him off balance with a move learned from countless nights defending her doorway. Detective Sullivan immediately moved in, cuffs ready, as police cars screeched into both ends of the alley. The murder attempts, the surveillance, the technology theft, it was all connected to something bigger, Richard explained, his eyes shining with understanding. They weren't just targeting wealthy men, they were building an autonomous security network to control the city's infrastructure. And they needed my foundation's research to complete it. Sarah watched in awe as her mother approached her, tears streaming down both their faces. I'm so sorry, Catherine whispered, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. Sending you away was the hardest thing I've ever done. But we needed someone on the outside, someone they wouldn't suspect, to protect the decryption key. But as the police led the criminals away, Richard's wife managed one final, chilling smile. You think this is over? She called out. Check your phone, dear husband. Check what's happening to your foundation's accounts right now. Richard pulled out his phone, his face paling at what he saw. Millions of dollars were being drained from his foundation's accounts, transferred to offshore locations faster than anyone could track. The organization had planted a failsafe, a digital time bomb set to destroy everything Richard had built. That's when Sarah started laughing, actually laughing, as she pulled out a battered old flip phone from her coat pocket. You mean these accounts? She asked, showing the screen to Richard's wife. The transfers were reversing, the money flowing back faster than it had left. 3 years on the streets taught me a lot about your operation, including how to write code. Mom wasn't the only one with a backup plan. The dawn was breaking over the city as the last police car pulled away. Richard turned to Sarah and Catherine, his expression one of deep gratitude and admiration. So, he said with a warm smile, about that position in my foundation's youth program. I think we might need to adjust the job title. How does Chief of Cybersecurity sound? Sarah looked at her mother, then back at Richard, tears of joy mixing with exhaustion and relief. But before she could answer, Detective Sullivan approached with an evidence bag containing a small USB drive found in the mechanical cat. You might want to see this first, she said quietly. It seems this story isn't quite over yet. Inside Richard's newly renovated foundation headquarters, Sarah sat between her mother and Richard, staring at the contents displayed on the giant screen before them. The USB drive had revealed something none of them expected: a list of dozens of other charitable foundations across the country, all targeted by the same organization, all with similar technology divisions working on pieces of the same puzzle. We weren't just stopping a local crime ring, Detective Sullivan explained, pointing to various highlighted entries. This was meant to be a nationwide surveillance network. But thanks to your combined efforts, we've already reached out to every foundation on this list. The entire operation is being dismantled as we speak. Richard leaned back in his chair, a mix of relief and purpose washing over his face. Which means our work is just beginning, he said thoughtfully. These foundations were chosen because they help people: homeless youth, struggling families, communities in need. We can't let their good work be tainted by what happened. Sarah looked down at her new security badge, still amazed by how much life could change in just a few days. She'd gone from sleeping in doorways to having her own office, from avoiding security cameras to designing systems to protect the vulnerable. But more importantly, she'd found a way to turn her hardest experiences into something meaningful. We're launching a new initiative, Catherine announced, pulling up a presentation on her tablet. The Street Smart Security Program. Using Sarah's experiences and insights, we're developing ways to protect homeless youth while respecting their privacy and independence. Because sometimes the best solutions come from those who've lived through the problems. The sunlight streamed through the window, catching the edge of the mechanical cat that now sat on Sarah's desk, reprogrammed and repurposed as a reminder of how appearances could be deceiving, and how even the darkest situations could lead to light. There's one thing I still don't understand, Sarah said, turning to her mother. How did you know I'd figure out what to do with the decryption program? I was just 16 when you gave it to me. Catherine smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. Because you've always seen things others miss. Even as a child, you noticed details everyone else overlooked. I didn't know exactly what you'd do with the program, I just knew you'd do the right thing with it. Richard cleared his throat, fighting back his own emotion. Speaking of doing the right thing, he said, I've set up a scholarship fund in your name. For other homeless youth who show the same kind of courage and ingenuity you did. Sometimes all people need is a chance to prove their worth. As they wrapped up the meeting, Sarah paused by the window, looking down at her old doorway across the street. A young homeless girl was sitting there now, and without hesitation, Sarah knew exactly what she needed to do next. That evening, as the sun set over the city, Sarah approached her old spot with a warm blanket and a business card. Because she'd learned that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. And as she sat down beside the surprised girl, Sarah began to tell her story, not just of survival, but of hope, redemption, and the incredible ways life could transform when you dared to help others. In the distance, the mechanical cat's eyes glowed softly blue, watching over the city it now helped protect. Because sometimes, Sarah realized, the best endings are actually new beginnings. And in this case, it was just the start of a much bigger story, one of second chances, restored families, and the remarkable power of seeing the potential in every person, no matter where they came from.